The past is not fixed. It lies beneath our feet like a river, flowing quietly, reshaping the banks of our memory. Tonight we stand at the edge of such a river, looking across to the other shore where history might have taken a gentler turn. It was the age of grand empires and fragile human hearts. It was the world of Jennie Jerome Churchill, an American heiress whose beauty, wit, and fire would one day help shape the course of an empire through the child she bore. But what if she had chosen another path? What if, on an autumn evening in 1874, she had refused the hand offered by power and reached instead for the quiet pulse of her own destiny? My friends, wherever and whenever you are listening, from quiet kitchens, warm with the hum of evening tea, to softly lit studies where the world outside grows still, I invite you to travel with me into the shadowed corridors of time. If these journeys speak to you, if the gentle breath of history brings comfort or wonder, I would be honored if you would subscribe and perhaps share where you are listening from. It is in these small acts that we keep the past alive together. And so, let us begin. The world into which Jennie Jerome was born in 1854 was one of steel and velvet, noise and constraint. In New York City, where she first opened her bright and watchful eyes, the clatter of iron horses on cobblestone streets mingled with the whispers of parlors and the measured steps of ambition. She was born not into the quiet simplicity of an ordinary home, but into the glittering and restless world of the Gilded Age, when fortunes were forged on the backs of rails and steam, and a new kind of American nobility rose to challenge the old European order. Her father, Leonard Jerome, was a man who understood the language of power well. His hands held newspapers, ledgers, and the fates of men. He believed in empire, not one with colonies, but with wealth. Her mother, Clara, had the soft elegance of a woman who knew how to make a room bend to her silence. Jennie grew between these two forces, ambition and refinement. In the great house where she lived, light would filter through high windows in the morning, laying stripes of gold across polished wood floors. She would walk through that light, a child with keen eyes, learning early how to see without being seen. She was not an obedient child, not exactly, nor was she rebellious. She was something quieter and perhaps more dangerous, curious. She listened to men speak of politics at dinner tables and noticed how they never asked what women thought. She learned to dance, to play piano, to speak softly at just the right moment. But beneath the silk and civility, a small flame burned, a desire to choose rather than to be chosen. In her world, however, doors did not open for such desires. They closed softly, politely, as if the possibility had never existed at all. As she grew into a young woman, Jennie's beauty began to be spoken of with almost the same reverence as her father's fortune. Men at parties would lower their voices when she passed, as though approaching a figure in a painting. But she heard them all the same, and she smiled in the careful way society required of her. She read books, poetry, histories, French novels smuggled beneath embroidery hoops. She learned how to navigate a world that did not yet believe she should steer her own course. The 1860s passed with war across the nation, a war she would have understood only in whispers and telegrams. But the world changed. And when peace came, so too did new opportunities for families like the Jeromes. Across the Atlantic, in England, the aristocracy looked toward American heiresses with fresh, hungry interest. The sons of dukes and earls carried ancient names but shrinking purses. The daughters of New York carried wealth but no title. And so, as if drawn by invisible threads, the two worlds began to weave together. Jennie was 15 when her mother first mentioned Europe as something more than a faraway idea. A proper marriage, Clara whispered one evening, could make their name as lasting as stone. Jennie did not respond. She looked at the firelight instead, and in the flickering reflection, she saw something she could not yet name, a door, not one that opened outward toward freedom, but one that stood firmly closed. By the time she turned 18, the Jeromes had traveled to Paris and London, mingling with the upper reaches of society. Jennie spoke French with ease, laughed with the charm expected of her, and began to understand how thin the line was between admiration and expectation. Men sought her attention not because of her mind, but because of the fortune she carried. She was beginning to see how often women like her were spoken of as if they were ships, to be launched, to be steered, to be owned. But in these years, another truth grew quietly within her. She had talent, not merely for beauty, but for connection, for understanding how words could change the shape of a room. She began writing short reflections in the margins of her journals, not for anyone to see, but for herself. "A woman who chooses nothing is herself unchosen," she wrote once. The ink bled slightly on the page, as if the paper itself had trembled. New York began to feel smaller. The grand drawing rooms that had once dazzled her now seemed gilded cages. In 1873, at 19 years old, Jennie looked across the Atlantic Ocean again, not as a hopeful bride-to-be, but as a restless mind searching for something unnamed. That same year, whispers came of an invitation to Cowes, on the Isle of Wight, where English society gathered to dance, to scheme, to find matches that suited both purse and pedigree. Her mother saw it as destiny, her father as investment. Jennie, though she said nothing, felt the cool brass of another closed door. But the wind over the Atlantic was not yet done with her. She stood on the deck of a steamer bound for England that summer, her gloved hand resting on the railing, eyes fixed on the gray-blue horizon. The sea air carried the scent of salt and possibility. She did not know that the decision waiting for her on the other side would not only shape her life, but echo across continents and centuries. She only knew that the door was still there, and that she might, for the first time, reach for the handle herself. The tide pushed steadily against the hull as England drew nearer, the land that expected her to step into the life prepared for her. But tides, like lives, do not always reach the shores they are meant for. And as the Atlantic winds whispered in 1873, a door opened, not of her choosing, but of history's design. The summer air of 1874 carried a certain softness over the Isle of Wight, a gentle warmth that lingered after sunset and clung to the silk gowns of those who moved through the gardens of Cowes. Lanterns floated like captured stars above the manicured lawns, and the murmur of English and American voices wove itself into the sea breeze. It was here, beneath the glow of light and empire, that Jennie Jerome Churchill first saw Lord Randolph Churchill. History, as it is written, tells us this was a fateful meeting. In that world, the one we know, she would soon accept his proposal, joining the Churchill name to her fortune and her wit, and giving birth to a son who would shape a century. But on this warm night, the air carried a different current. She watched Randolph with clear eyes, not dazzled by his name, nor by the crown that hovered, unseen above the society he represented. She listened to his practiced charm, the way he spoke as if the world were already decided and he merely a part of its clockwork. And something within her, something that had grown quietly since childhood, stirred against the weight of inevitability. As music drifted across the lawn, she stepped away from the crowded ballroom into the cool night air. The house behind her was a theater of expectation. Women whispered behind fans. Men watched with proprietary amusement. She had been raised to understand this language, to speak it fluently. But standing beneath the quiet sweep of stars, she realized she did not wish to play this part. Not as written. Not tonight. The gentle clink of glasses faded. The sounds of laughter and promise blurred. There was only the rustle of her skirts and the slow rhythm of her breath as she found herself by the edge of the water. The tide was low, and the faint ripple of waves against stone echoed softly, as if the sea itself were breathing with her. When Randolph found her there, he mistook her quiet for shyness. His words were practiced, half compliment, half presumption. He spoke of marriage as though the world had already decided it, as though she need only nod to fulfill the path set before her. His confidence was the kind that had never known refusal. But Jennie did not answer right away. She lifted her gaze to meet his, steady and calm, and in that single moment the fragile scaffolding of expectation trembled, almost imperceptibly. The night held its breath. Later that evening, alone in her borrowed room, she sat before a mirror, removing her jewels one by one. Each piece of gold and pearl seemed to gleam with the weight of what they signified, not beauty, but a promise to be ornamental. Outside, the faint sound of waves pressed against the shore, patient and constant. In that mirror, she saw not the dazzling creature others saw, but a woman at a crossroads with no signposts. She thought of her father's ambitions, her mother's quiet sighs, the endless train of women who had walked this same path without ever asking if there was another. And so it was that the choice, when it came, was neither dramatic nor loud. She did not run away in a storm nor break some scandalous vow. She simply spoke softly to him the next day in a sunlit garden when the world expected her to accept. She told him no, not cruelly, not defiantly, but with a kind of serene certainty that left no room for argument. Randolph's expression shifted from disbelief to a brittle smile. He had never been refused by a woman like her. There was no script for this moment in the polite society of 1874, but she had written her own. Word traveled swiftly, as it always does in rooms where fortunes and titles dance together. Whispers circled her like curious birds, some scandalized, some amused, some almost admiring. She had refused not merely a man, but a place within one of the oldest political families of England. Her parents, too, felt the tremor. Her father raged quietly, pacing rooms. Her mother pressed cold hands together in the darkness, imagining the narrowing of doors in English drawing rooms. For Jennie, there was no triumph in this decision, only the clear, quiet knowledge that the road ahead would be far less certain, but more truly hers. That summer, as London's season ended and the last of the society carriages rolled away from Cowes, she stood again by the water where it had begun. The sea was different now, not a mirror of what might be, but an invitation to what was yet unknown. She could return to America and find a more conventional match. She could remain in Europe and face the slow suffocation of gossip. Or she could do something else entirely, something she could not yet name but felt, like a tide pulling her outward. Her decision, though made quietly, had created ripples that would never be contained again. The papers mentioned it obliquely, an American beauty, an English lord, a romance unfulfilled. But beneath their polite phrasing lay the quiet shock of society, realizing that a young woman had said no to what was meant to be her destiny. She was neither ruined nor celebrated. She simply continued to exist on her own terms. And in the soft glow of her own reflection, she began to understand how rare that was. In later years, Jennie would remember this summer as the season when the air shifted, not because of what she gained, but because of what she refused to surrender. It was the beginning of a life that would not be written in the ledgers of marriage and inheritance, but in the quiet margins where women like her had always carved their truths. Some tides are meant to pull one away, not toward the shore. The autumn that followed was unlike any other Jennie had known. Gone was the silken certainty of her family's carefully drawn future. In its place lay something at once thrilling and terrifying, a silence unfilled by expectation. In New York, the drawing rooms buzzed with the polite scandal of her refusal, though no one said it outright. Her father, Leonard, pretended to be absorbed in business matters, yet every conversation seemed to circle back to what she had done. Her mother's voice, once cool and precise, now carried the faint tremor of worry. "You have closed a great door," she whispered one evening as Jennie sat at her dressing table, "and the world does not always open another." Jennie looked at her own reflection in the mirror, still young, still beautiful, still entirely herself. "Then I will find one," she answered softly. Her mother said nothing more. But as winter pressed its cold hand against the windows of their Manhattan home, Jennie felt a restlessness, stirring like an unplayed note. She had lived her life surrounded by certainty, where to stand, when to smile, how to be chosen, but having stepped outside of that, she could no longer fit within it. She walked through the drawing rooms of the city as if she were a guest in a house she no longer wished to inhabit. The invitations that once came so thickly slowed to a trickle. The daughters of other families were quietly married off to counts, earls, and industrial heirs. Jennie remained unmarried, untouched, unpinned. Her father tried to speak of matches, wealthy bankers, ambitious politicians, but her gaze always drifted elsewhere. She had refused one empire. She was not about to surrender to another. In early 1875, she convinced her father to allow her to travel again, not as a daughter on display, but as a woman with her own designs. Paris called to her like a half-remembered song, a place where women spoke more freely, where salons hummed with ideas instead of matchmaking. The journey across the Atlantic was slower this time. She spent hours on deck wrapped in a dark shawl, watching the sea foam churn and collapse beneath the ship's bow. It was the sound of something shedding itself, of something being remade in silence. She did not yet know what shape her new life would take, only that it would not be bound by the delicate golden chains she had so carefully slipped from. Paris in spring had the tender glow of gaslight on wet cobblestones. The air smelled of rain and tobacco and possibility. Here, Jennie was not the failed bride of an English lord. She was simply Mademoiselle Jerome, an American with a bright mind, a sharp tongue, and a beauty that softened the edges of her boldness. She rented a modest apartment near the Boulevard Saint-Germain, a neighborhood where artists, poets, and expatriates mingled at cafes late into the night. It was a world not of titles but of voices, voices that argued, dreamed, doubted, and dared. At first, she walked among them quietly, like someone listening to a language she had long known but never spoken aloud. She listened to students talk of revolutions that had failed and revolutions yet to come. She heard painters speak of light as if it were a living creature, something to be captured and freed. She read essays by philosophers who dared to question the structures of power that had once seemed as fixed as stone. Slowly, she began to speak too, not loudly, not to command, but with the steady rhythm of someone who has found a pulse in the world that matches her own. It was in those cafes, beneath ceilings browned with years of smoke, that Jennie first began to write. At first, it was little more than observations on scraps of paper, reflections on the difference between how women were seen and who they were beneath the gaze. But soon those fragments became letters, and letters became essays. She wrote under a pseudonym, one that carried no hint of New York privilege or English scandal. Her words were clear, deliberate, and unafraid. She wrote of what it meant to be trapped by expectations woven into the fabric of society. She wrote not as a victim, but as a woman walking out of a gilded cage with her head held high. The salons of Paris noticed her not for her beauty, though she still possessed it in abundance, but for the quiet force of her mind. She met writers and thinkers, women who had chosen paths even narrower and more dangerous than hers. Some lived by their pen, some by their wits, some by neither, and yet survived. They did not ask her why she had refused Lord Randolph Churchill. They did not care. They asked her instead what she thought of empire, of power, of a woman's place at the table. And for the first time in her life, she answered freely. Yet even in this city of ideas, Jennie was not entirely at ease. There were nights when the gaslight flickered against the damp stone walls and loneliness pressed against her chest like a steady weight. She had chosen freedom, but freedom has its own silences. There were no grand halls welcoming her, no father's wealth cushioning each step. What she had now was the open road of her own making, uneven, uncertain, but hers. As months passed into years, she traveled through France and Italy, collecting impressions like stones in her pocket. The marble courtyards of Florence, the soft lavender light of Provence, the restless chatter of Rome's piazzas. They shaped her gently but irrevocably. She was learning not to be someone's daughter, someone's prospect, someone's ornament. She was learning to be simply Jennie. And somewhere in those quiet years, the girl who had once stood before closed doors became the woman who would build her own. Her name would never appear in the peerage of Britain. But her voice, quiet at first, then steady, would soon begin to echo in the places where the empire least expected it. But freedom, as it often does, soon calls for a purpose greater than itself. The winter of 1878 arrived in Paris as a pale mist that softened the edges of everything it touched. The boulevards were veiled in light fog, cafes smelled of strong coffee and damp wool, and Jennie, now 24, felt a deep, almost electric stillness inside her, a stillness not of hesitation, but of coiled readiness. She had wandered long enough to understand that a life without ownership of oneself is no life at all. Yet she also began to see that freedom, left untethered, can fade into silence if it finds no purpose. She had left behind the expectations of marriage, the clattering gossip of transatlantic society, the polished cages of both London and New York. Now she faced a different question, quieter and far more difficult. What would she build in their place? Her world was no longer the world of carriages and arranged introductions. It was smoke-filled parlors and salons where words, sharp, elegant, sometimes brutal, were the currency of power. She began attending evening gatherings hosted by women whose names were spoken in hushed admiration, salonières, who had shaped the cultural pulse of Paris through wit and subtlety. There she met artists with paint under their fingernails, journalists who wore their hunger like a badge, composers who still believed music could awaken nations. They welcomed her not as a curiosity, not as an heiress, but as a mind among other minds. And in this new soil, her voice began to take root. In those gatherings, she met writers who spoke of the fragility of empire, philosophers who dissected the thin veneer of civilization, and suffragists who dreamed of a world in which women might stand without apology. She listened carefully at first, as she always had, but her silence was no longer the silence of submission. It was the silence of someone sharpening her thoughts, waiting for the right moment to strike the table with a sentence so clear it could not be ignored. And when she finally did speak, the room listened. She began publishing her first essays under the name J.L. Rowan, a pseudonym she chose deliberately, neither masculine nor feminine, neither American nor European. The essays were brief at first, quiet ripples in a vast pond, reflections on how power is built not only by soldiers and kings, but by the silent complicity of those who never speak. Her words found their way into small journals, then larger periodicals. They traveled farther than she had ever expected. In London, certain circles whispered about this mysterious writer. In New York, her father's acquaintances speculated with a mixture of pride and discomfort. She had become visible in a way they could neither control nor fully understand. By 1879, Jennie had become something rare in the European world, an unmarried woman of independent means who was not merely surviving, but shaping conversations. She hosted her own modest salons, nothing ostentatious, no glittering chandeliers or velvet drapery, just low lamplight, books stacked against the walls, and wine poured into mismatched glasses. There, voices gathered not for gossip but for fire. Painters argued with philosophers, feminists challenged poets, diplomats listened uneasily to radicals. And through it all, Jennie sat with the steady, unhurried composure of a woman who no longer waited to be chosen. She was, at last, doing the choosing. And yet, beneath her confidence, something quietly shifted. A letter arrived one morning from New York, its edges crisp, the handwriting elegant and unmistakably her father's. It contained neither reproach nor praise, only a single line. The world will not forgive you for being more than it asked you to be." She folded the letter slowly and placed it in a drawer without response. But that single line lingered like a whisper in the corners of her mind, not as a warning, but as a truth she already knew. Paris, with its endless talk and fragile ideals, began to feel both exhilarating and insufficient. Jennie had begun to sense that words, beautiful as they were, could only shift so much of the world from the safety of a salon. If she truly believed in what she wrote, she would need to step beyond the threshold of conversation. She began to consider London again, not as the young girl who once arrived at Cowes under the weight of expectation, but as a woman whose voice might carry into the very heart of the empire she had once refused. One evening, as the last of her guests left her apartment and the echoes of debate still hummed in the walls, she walked out onto the narrow balcony that overlooked the street. The lamps below burned dimly through the fog. She felt the damp air against her face, steady and cold. This was not the air of submission, but of thresholds. She understood then that Paris had been a chrysalis. London would be something else entirely, a crucible. But before she left, she allowed herself one act of quiet defiance. In her final essay of that year, she wrote not about empire or politics, but about choice. She wrote of doors that women were told were never meant to open, of the lives they could have lived had they reached for the handle. It was an essay that would be copied in parlors, whispered in tea rooms, dismissed by politicians, and remembered by women who had no names in the newspapers. She signed it for the first time, not as J.L. Rowan, but simply as Jennie Jerome. One letter remained unopened, but not unread by fate. The spring of 1881 arrived with a pale sunlight that softened the hard stone faces of London. When Jennie stepped off the train at Paddington Station, the air carried a different weight than Paris. Here, conversation was less about ideas and more about the careful arrangement of power. The carriages outside moved with a kind of ceremonial order, as though every horse, every wheel, every polished brass lantern knew its place in a world built on centuries of hierarchy. She had been here once before as a young woman meant to be claimed. Now she returned not as a bride, but as a force unto herself. Her reputation had crossed the channel before she did. London society whispered of the American who had refused an English lord, then disappeared to France to host salons that attracted radicals, poets, and political dissidents. They did not quite know what to do with such a woman. She did not fit neatly into the categories they understood, neither a scandal nor a saint, neither a threat nor a prize. Invitations to dinner came hesitantly at first, as if extended with gloved hands that could be withdrawn at any moment. But Jennie knew how to walk into a room. She had been trained in that art since girlhood, not to be subservient, but to move through spaces as though she belonged in them. And that, more than any title, unsettled people. The London of 1881 was a city perched on the brink of change, but still wearing its old costume. The empire was vast, its reach stretching across continents, but cracks had begun to form in its polished veneer. Workers marched, writers murmured. Colonies stirred beneath the weight of British rule. The salons and drawing rooms were filled with talk that sounded calm, but smelled faintly of smoke. Jennie felt it immediately, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. She understood that London was not Paris. Here, words were not merely ideas. They were potential weapons, sharpened and sheathed beneath the softness of polite conversation. She rented a townhouse in Bloomsbury, modest in size but rich in light. The drawing room had tall windows framed with heavy drapes, and at night the lamplight pooled across the wooden floors like warm honey. It was here, in this room, that she began to gather voices. At first, it was only a handful of acquaintances, a young journalist from the Pall Mall Gazette with restless eyes, a suffragist who had marched with mud on her boots, an Irish poet with laughter that often masked fury. But word spread, as it always does when conversation becomes dangerous in just the right way. Soon her evenings filled with people who understood that something could be spoken in Jennie Jerome's house that could not be said anywhere else in London. These were not the glittering social gatherings of the upper class. There was no orchestra in the corner, no parading of names. Guests arrived without fanfare and left in the early hours with their thoughts unsettled. The air in those rooms carried the sharp scent of ink, tobacco, and new ideas. Men who had once dismissed her as a curiosity began to lean forward when she spoke. Women, especially, found in her a reflection of something they had not yet dared to name, the possibility of a life that did not require permission. Jennie had no official power, no title, no seat in Parliament, but she understood something deeper, how to make a room listen, and London did listen. A series of articles began appearing in discreet corners of respectable papers. They questioned the language of empire, not with fiery revolution, but with quiet, piercing reason. The writer's name was never printed, but many suspected. She had learned to weave her words not as weapons of war, but as threads that slowly unraveled old tapestries. And in this way, she began to alter the texture of the city itself. Not everyone welcomed her presence. The older families, with their rows of portraits staring down from paneled walls, viewed her as an elegant contagion. She had refused the expected path, and yet she thrived. That alone was dangerous. There were invitations that stopped arriving, glances that cooled into frost, but Jennie did not seek their approval. Her gaze was fixed not on their tables, but on the long, quiet streets where ideas began their slow march toward history. One evening in early autumn, as a storm grumbled beyond the rooftops, Jennie found herself at the window of her salon after the last guest had gone. The rain tapped softly against the glass, and the city lay quiet beneath a shroud of mist. In that silence, she felt the same pulse she had felt years before at Cowes, when she first said no, the deep, unshakable sense that she had stepped out of someone else's story and into her own. And yet, unlike that night, she was no longer alone. The ripples she had set into motion were beginning to find their way into other lives, other conversations, other rooms she would never even see. It would be easy to imagine her as a figure of fire, dramatic, loud, shaking the foundations of empire with a single speech. But that was not her way. Her power lay in the quiet persistence of presence. She did not shout against the storm. She taught others to listen to it. The city that once expected her silence now listened without knowing why. The winter fog rolled over London in 1882 like a long, slow exhale, softening even the hard marble faces of its grandest buildings. Jennie Jerome walked through those streets now not as an observer, but as someone being observed, though not always by name. In the parlors of political men, in the corridors of newspapers, in quiet meetings over cognac and cigars, people spoke of the gatherings that were beginning to shape whispers into thought, and thought into early, fragile movements. She had not set out to build an influence. She'd only followed the compass of her own refusal. But influence, like water, finds its way through even the smallest cracks. One evening, beneath the yellow gaslight of a winter rain, Jennie sat in her drawing room as conversation swirled around her like smoke. A young Irish journalist leaned forward with the impatience of someone who wanted to set fire to the world. A suffragist spoke with the precise calm of someone who had already been arrested twice and would be again. And across from them sat a nervous, ambitious clerk from the War Office, a man who would later rise in politics. Jennie did not speak often, but when she did, the room bent slightly toward her. She had a way of asking questions that stripped rhetoric bare. Why this war? Why this silence? What if the choices we accept as inevitable are only habits dressed in uniforms? Her voice was soft, but the air shifted when she spoke. There was, of course, an absence in this world that history itself could feel. In another timeline, a boy named Winston Churchill would have been 8 years old by now, sharp, restless, already being shaped by the weight of his father's name and his mother's ambition. But here, no such child existed. The house in Blenheim was quieter, colder, its corridors filled only with the expectations of an old family and the slow fading of Lord Randolph's influence. The Churchills sought other alliances, other marriages, but without Jennie, the chain of events that would have lifted their name to the very center of history began to soften, like a letter left out in the rain. Jennie herself never spoke of the man she might have married. She thought of him perhaps when London society grew too brittle, or when she passed a grand carriage bearing the Churchill crest, but there was no regret in her. What she had refused was not a man, but a future already written for her, and in its place she was writing a different one, not on battlefields or in Parliament, but in the subtle rearranging of minds. Her salons became less a curiosity and more a quiet force. Invitations, once extended cautiously, now came from unexpected quarters. A duke's daughter with a sharp intellect came seeking conversation. A banker's wife who had grown weary of being ornamental found in Jennie the language to name her restlessness. A playwright brought drafts that could never appear on a stage but thrived in whispered readings. Each gathering ended with the same strange hush, the sound of ideas lingering after people left, like smoke that refuses to clear. But London was not kind to women who stood outside its carefully drawn lines. Her influence made her a subject of fascination and unease. Some accused her of stirring radical sentiment, others, more quietly, of corrupting proper women with dangerous questions. A certain London paper published a veiled critique referring to foreign women of dangerous eloquence who forgot the proper boundaries of their sex. Jennie read it over her morning tea, set the paper down, and laughed. Not a loud laugh, but one sharp enough to cut through the stillness of the room. The words stung, yes, but they also confirmed something. She was no longer invisible. Among those who visited her house regularly was a young Irish writer with eyes like flint and a laugh that could disguise almost any sorrow. He admired her mind openly, unlike most men of her class. Their bond grew not from the desperate urgency of romance, but from shared conviction. He spoke of Ireland and its broken promises. She listened with the patience of someone who understood empire from both the outside and the inside. In time, their lives intertwined, not with ceremony, not with contracts, but with a quiet, living trust. She did not become his wife. She became something rarer in their time, his partner. The absence of Winston Churchill's birth was not an empty space in her life. It was a path redirected. Instead of raising a boy to carry an empire's expectations, she began to mentor voices who would speak against its weight. Young journalists found courage in her parlor. Women found words. Men found questions they could not unhear. London, that ancient city of smoke and stone, found itself slowly, uneasily, listening. A single missing name in a ledger, and the century shifts its weight. By the time 1886 arrived, London carried within it an undercurrent too subtle for its rulers to name, but strong enough for those who lived beneath the crust of power to feel. The empire's banner still fluttered from its great ships, and its officers still strode through the colonies with the certainty of inherited dominion, but something quieter had begun to hum beneath the surface. It was not revolution. It was a slow rearranging of questions. Jennie Jerome had never intended to build movements, yet every soft word, every gathering in her lamp-lit drawing room, every essay tucked into the pages of journals had become strands of a web that was beginning to hold shape. Her voice, once hidden behind pseudonyms, was now whispered about openly. A woman writing of empire with neither apology nor theatrical outrage was disorienting to a society accustomed to women who confined themselves to charity and polite causes. She did not rage. She did not plead. She reasoned with such clarity that even those who dismissed her felt the uncomfortable tug of her words at the edges of their certainty. It was said in Parliament's corridors, never in official debates, but in those shadowed, whiskey-laced corners where politics truly moved. That the American woman with the salons had a way of making clever men uncertain. And in an empire built on certainty, that alone was dangerous. Her partnership with the Irish writer had deepened into something both intimate and political. He, sharp, fiery, irreverent, carried in him a wounded country's bitterness. She carried an American's memory of having once been colonized and then becoming something else. Together, they understood empire not as an abstraction, but as a wound that could be both visible and unseen. Their bond was never performed in public. There was no need. It lived in shared glances during evenings when conversation reached its most dangerous points, in the quiet exchanges of drafts, in the late-night walks along the misted Thames when words no longer sufficed. In these years, Jennie's essays became bolder. She began writing about what the British press liked to call the imperial burden, stripping away the euphemism to show the human weight beneath it. She wrote of India, not as a place of exotic color, but as a land pressed beneath boots. She wrote of Ireland as a wound left festering, not a province to be managed. She wrote of Africa, not as a map of resources, but as a place filled with lives too often rendered invisible. What startled her critics most was not what she said, but the quiet precision with which she said it. She was neither easily dismissed nor easily absorbed into existing narratives. And for a woman without a title, without a party, without a family name to shield her, this was extraordinary. London's salons began to change in response. It was no longer enough to host dinners with carefully controlled conversation. Ideas were creeping into rooms where they had long been unwelcome. Politicians sent their wives to her gatherings, half out of curiosity, half out of a wish to keep her under observation. Some returned changed, though they would never admit it aloud. Others returned with rumors that only amplified her legend. Jennie herself remained steady, moving through this growing storm with the same quiet self-possession she had carried since that long-ago night in Cowes when she first refused to be chosen. Of course, power noticed. Power always notices, eventually. A small but deliberate campaign to undermine her began in the press. Anonymous editorials painted her as a romantic meddler, a woman too clever for her own good. Some whispered that she was being used by radicals, others that she used men for her own political amusements. Jennie read these attacks without bitterness. She understood them for what they were, a sign that her words had begun to land where they were not meant to. There were nights when the city felt cold to her, when the fog seemed to seep into her bones, and the long walk home along the river pressed upon her like a question. Would she endure? She had no army, no formal institution, no legacy secured by blood, but she had something that frightened those who sat atop the empire's machinery. She had become a point of convergence for doubt, and doubt, once born, never quite dies. In the dim stillness of those nights, she thought of the boy who might have existed, of Winston, the child who would never carry her name into the annals of history. But these thoughts did not arrive with regret. They arrived with a kind of quiet clarity. Her life was not meant to be a vessel for the ambitions of men, nor the inheritance of one extraordinary child. Her legacy would not be carved into marble statues or etched into the names of wars. It would be scattered like fine dust across the words of others, untraceable, enduring. The newspapers of the time tell little of these moments. They speak instead of military campaigns, of debates in Parliament, of colonial expeditions. But beneath those headlines, the salons of London shifted shape. And in that subtle, persistent shifting, Jennie's voice became a thread in the fabric of a new kind of unrest. Not the loud kind, but the one that slowly, invisibly, frays the edges of certainty. Voices can rise softly and still shake marble halls. The summer of 1890 found Jennie standing at the threshold of something she had not entirely foreseen, the limits of distance between speech and consequence. For more than a decade she had spoken, written, hosted and questioned from within the polite gas-lit rooms of London. But now the tide of empire itself seemed to be pushing her outward, urging her to look not merely upon the mechanisms of power, but upon the world that lay beneath its heel. She had written of places she had never seen, relying on letters, newspapers, and travelers' accounts. But words she was beginning to understand had their truest weight when anchored in the dirt and blood of lived experience. An invitation arrived not through the channels of society, but through the hand of an acquaintance, an idealistic doctor who had served in southern Africa and who returned with stories that carried the scent of dust and smoke. The Empire called it expansion. He called it occupation. Jennie read his words by lamplight late into the night, the edges of the letter warmed by her fingers. Something in it stirred her, an unease that had been building beneath the elegance of her arguments. She had always believed in the power of thought, of reason, of ideas spoken clearly into the air. But now, for the first time, she questioned whether her words were still tethered to something real or had begun to float above the ground like pale, fragile paper. Against the soft objections of friends and the veiled disapproval of London society, she decided to travel to Africa. It was not a romantic impulse nor a gesture of charity. It was a need to see with her own eyes what she had spent years describing in careful language. She boarded the ship in Southampton in early autumn, the air cool, the sea gray and wide. The deck smelled of salt and coal smoke. As the coast of England disappeared into the mist, Jennie felt no fear, only a quiet, weighty resolve. The heat struck her upon arrival like a living thing. The landscape was unlike anything she had known. Vast plains breathing under a relentless sun, air dry and sharp, nights filled with stars that seemed closer and more insistent than any she had ever seen. She traveled with the doctor and a few others, not as a dignitary or observer, but quietly, almost anonymously. And what she saw stripped away the careful distances that had once protected her from the fullness of empire's cruelty. Villages flattened not by accident but by deliberate policy. Fields taken, not shared. Children with the blank, hard gaze of those who had already learned the price of being invisible. Soldiers who did not see themselves as cruel, only obedient. It was not the spectacle of conquest that struck her, but its banality. How simple, how organized, how ordinary injustice could be when it dressed itself in uniforms. She did not write immediately. She watched. She listened. She stood in the heavy heat and let the reality of what she had only described settle into the marrow of her bones. There were no elegant phrases to soften it. The Empire was not an abstract force of distant men in London. It was right here, in the dust, in the sound of boots crushing dry grass, in the indifferent gaze of men who believed themselves civilized. On the long nights of that journey, Jennie sat by small fires listening to the quiet breath of the land and the low conversations of those who still resisted in whispers. The faces around her were strangers, but the shared silence carried a weight she understood more clearly than any speech she had heard in London. Empires speak loudly. Those they crush often speak in silence. It was that silence she would remember most. When she returned to England months later, she was no longer merely a writer of thoughtful critiques. She had seen what could not be unseen. Her first essay after that journey was unlike any she had written before. It did not argue. It did not persuade. It bore witness. She described what she had seen without embellishment, without rage, without rhetorical dressing. Her words fell like stones into the polite water of public discourse, and the ripples reached farther than she expected. Some applauded her courage, some accused her of treason, and others simply turned their faces away. But what none could do was ignore her. The government's discomfort was palpable, but quiet, the way discomfort often is when it cannot yet find its shape. Editors debated whether to print her work. Politicians whispered about the Jerome problem. But the public, or at least those who listened closely, began to feel a shift. The empire no longer felt quite so clean, quite so distant. A woman had returned from its edges with truths that could not be dismissed as the fantasies of radicals or the exaggerations of men hungry for power. Jennie grew quieter in society after her return. She declined more invitations, spent longer hours at her desk, wrote with fewer flourishes and more weight. She had stepped beyond salons and essays. She had walked into the body of the beast itself and returned with a scar that did not show but never faded. Her partner understood it without words. He saw it in her silences, in the way she sometimes stopped speaking mid-sentence, as though remembering something far away, in the way she no longer entertained the polite questions of dinner guests who wished to treat empire as an intellectual puzzle. The nights in London felt colder after Africa. The fog seemed thicker. The world she had once moved through with such elegance now felt brittle, a performance she could no longer convincingly play. Yet in that chill, something within her hardened, not into anger, but into purpose. She returned not with treasures, but with truths that silenced rooms. By the close of the decade, the world around Jennie had shifted in subtle but irrevocable ways. London remained a city, wrapped in the finery of its empire. The carriages still gleamed beneath gaslight, the parlors still filled with the soft clink of glass and restrained laughter. Yet beneath that surface, she sensed a tremor. Small at first, then growing more insistent, like the low hum before a storm. People spoke differently now. Not everyone, not everywhere, but in small corners and hushed gatherings, the tone had changed. The stories she had brought back from Africa had done something she herself could not have fully predicted. They had made the empire visible not as a distant crown on a map, but as something living, breathing, crushing. And once seen, the shape of power could not be unseen. Jennie, for her part, had grown quieter, but not less present. The salon she hosted in her Bloomsbury home no longer sought to impress or dazzle. The gatherings became more deliberate, the conversations heavier, the laughter rarer but more honest when it came. She had no desire to lead anything resembling a movement. That was never her ambition. But movements, like rivers, do not always wait for their makers. They form where currents meet, and she had become such a current, steady, persistent, unplanned. Around her now gathered a generation of younger voices, men and women who had grown up in the waning light of Queen Victoria's long reign and could sense, perhaps without quite naming it, that the world they had inherited was beginning to fray. Among them were women whose eyes held the fierce clarity of purpose that comes from having been denied too long. They spoke not of parlors but of picket lines, not of polite petitions but of rights. They admired Jennie not for her fame, but for the fact that she had stepped away from the path laid before her and carved her own. Some of these women were barely out of their 20s, burning with a kind of heat Jennie no longer possessed, but still remembered. She did not try to lead them. She offered them what she had always offered the world, a space in which to speak freely and be heard without apology. It was during these years that her name, spoken in the right circles, became more than just a rumor. She was not adored like a society figure, nor feared like a politician. She was respected in a quieter, steadier way. A woman who had stood firm for too long to be dismissed, and who had chosen to live by thought rather than permission. She never stood on a platform, never shouted through the streets, yet her words continued to echo through the articles and pamphlets of others. Ideas she had seeded years before returned to her now in the mouths of strangers, reshaped and roughened by their journey through the world. Her partner, ever restless, often urged her to speak more publicly, to take a visible role in what he called the age that is waking. But Jennie knew her power did not lie on platforms. It lay in the weaving of threads beneath them, in the spaces where language was born before it turned to slogans. She mentored without declaring it, guided without commanding. The young women who came to her house often left changed, not because she gave them answers, but because she did not pretend to have them. She listened. She asked questions. She handed them their own voices. The absence of a son was never discussed in these rooms, but it was felt like a kind of hollow space around which her legacy was built. In the world history remembers, Winston Churchill would soon have been rising, a brash and brilliant young man making his name on the empire's battlefields. But in this one, there was no such figure to cast a long shadow across the century. The empire itself, lacking the fierce voice that would one day rally it through fire, moved differently, less certain of itself, more fractured at the edges. Jennie, unknowingly, had altered the course of an entire nation, not by creating, but by refusing. She did not measure her days in victories. She measured them in the quiet transformations she could see in the faces around her. One evening in 1898, as London sank into that deep violet dusk that belongs only to late summer, she sat by the tall window of her study with a shawl drawn around her shoulders. The house was quiet. The street outside glimmered faintly with the light of a passing carriage. She thought then, not in words, but in that slow, full way one thinks near the end of a long season, about the strange shape of her life. There was no crown, no family line, no place in the archives of empire waiting for her, and yet there was something, a kind of invisible inheritance, a legacy scattered among others. It was a legacy she could feel now taking root. The young women she had mentored were stepping beyond her parlor, speaking in halls she would never enter. One of them, a fiery speaker from Manchester, had just published her first piece in a national newspaper, a piece clearly born of conversations had beneath Jennie's lamplight. Another, a quiet woman with sharp eyes, had been arrested for protesting working conditions in a textile mill. Jennie followed these stories with neither pride nor possessiveness, only the deep, quiet recognition of seeds taking root. The seeds she scattered found soil where she least expected it. The first years of the new century arrived with the peculiar stillness that often precedes a storm. London was changing, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. The grand old city wore its imperial pride like an aging actor wearing a costume grown a little too tight. Its buildings still gleamed with the marble certainty of an empire that believed itself eternal. Its parades and pageants still thundered through the streets with drums and brass and banners declaring the dominion of the crown. And yet beneath all that, the sound of another rhythm had begun to rise, quiet and persistent, the murmur of doubt, of discontent, of awakening voices that no longer accepted the old narratives as gospel. It was into this world that Jennie, now in her mid-40s, walked with the calm steadiness of someone who had learned to recognize the tremors beneath the polished surface of things. The power she held was not the kind that could be measured in votes or money or titles. It was something far more elusive and, in its way, more enduring. By now, her name carried an unmistakable weight in the private conversations of those who mattered, though many of them would not admit it aloud. Ministers, editors, suffragists, and poets alike understood that an evening in Jennie Jerome's parlor could alter the shape of a thought, and thoughts, when they travel far enough, can alter the shape of history. She had no formal party, no office, no faction, but she was a quiet force around which the restless and the thoughtful seemed to gather. The events unfolding across the globe gave her words a sharper edge. Conflicts flared in Africa and Asia, and the empire responded with its usual mixture of pomp and steel. But this time, the applause was not quite so unanimous. The essays she had written years before had found new life as others echoed her arguments in their own voices. Pamphlets quoted her without naming her. Members of Parliament dismissed her while quietly reading what she wrote. Women cited her at suffrage meetings, not as an idol, but as one of their own, a woman who had simply refused to play her part, and in doing so opened a door that others might walk through. Among the younger generation, there was a growing sense that the empire could not continue as it had. Jennie could feel this in the air around her gatherings, in the restless energy that filled her house at night. Gone were the hesitant, searching tones of the salons of her youth. These new voices spoke with conviction. A young Indian student at Oxford spoke of self-determination with quiet dignity. A group of women from the north of England spoke of the vote as something inevitable, not as a plea. A former soldier, returned disillusioned from Africa, spoke of the difference between glory and grief. These were not the polished conversations of polite society. They were raw, full of unfinished edges, and Jennie welcomed them. She no longer stood at the center of the room as she once had. Age had softened her sharp beauty, and her voice, though still steady, now carried the weight of experience rather than the fire of youth. But she did not need to lead the conversation. She had already done the work of making space for it to happen. She watched now as others filled that space with urgency, with hunger, with voices that rose beyond her walls and spilled into the wider world. She recognized in them the same restlessness she had felt standing by the sea all those years ago, when she had first chosen to refuse the easy destiny offered to her. It was strange to witness it, mirrored back in so many faces. The government, for its part, felt the shift. Some dismissed it as fashionable agitation, a passing fever among intellectuals and radicals. Others, more attuned to history's undercurrents, began to worry. Policies were debated with increasing unease. Speeches that once would have been met with applause now found themselves answered with polite, simmering skepticism. Jennie could feel that the empire itself had begun to hesitate, not to fall, not yet, but to blink, as though realizing for the first time that its image of itself was not entirely shared by those beneath it. On a gray afternoon in 1903, Jennie sat alone by the fire in her drawing room, reading the latest reports from the colonies. The rain tapped against the window panes, soft but insistent. She thought of how far she had traveled, not in miles, though there were many of those, but in the long arc of a life lived in refusal of silence. She thought of that young woman at Cowes, the one who had simply said no to a man and a marriage that would have bound her to a history she did not choose. She thought of the years in Paris, the nights in Africa, the countless evenings spent listening to others discover their own voices in the safe hush of her home. And as she sat there, listening to the rain, she understood something very simple. She had become part of a story that would not carry her name, but would nonetheless be shaped by her existence. That was enough. She had never sought a legacy that wore a crown. Even great empires pause, if only to listen to the wind. By the time 1906 arrived, the chill of early winter seemed to settle not only over London's rooftops, but over Jennie's bones. The years had gathered around her like quiet snow, soft and weighty, and she no longer moved through the city with the same restless energy she once possessed. She had entered a different season of her life, one in which the world outside was no longer a horizon she sought to conquer or understand, but a great and shifting landscape she could simply observe. From her window in Bloomsbury, she often watched the fog roll in across the street, blurring the edges of the lamps until the world looked like a half-remembered dream. The city that had once demanded so much of her now moved without her needing to push against it. And perhaps, for the first time, she led it. Her salon, once bright with the clamor of eager voices, had grown quieter. The young men and women she had once gathered around her table now filled rooms of their own. They spoke in halls and meeting rooms, printed pamphlets, stood on platforms, and argued in spaces far larger than her modest drawing room. She had become, without quite intending it, a kind of elder in their world, respected, remembered, sometimes even mythologized. They came to her now less for conversation than for counsel. And though she no longer traveled far, her words traveled without her. Jennie's health had begun to waver in those years, not dramatically, but in the slow, insistent way that reminds one of the body's finite nature. Fatigue clung to her like a shawl she could not quite remove, yet she did not fight it. Instead, she began to spend her days in the company of quiet things, the sound of a kettle hissing softly on the stove, the ticking of a clock she had owned for decades, the faint rustle of pages turning beneath her fingers. She reread books that had once stirred her in youth, not to rekindle old passions, but to understand how she herself had changed. Words she had once read as promises now felt like gentle farewells. The world outside continued its slow awakening. Women marched more boldly now. Colonial resistance was no longer confined to whispered discontent. It found its way into newspapers, into political debates, into the uneasy dreams of those who governed. Jennie saw this with a quiet satisfaction that she rarely voiced. It was not victory, nor did she believe in such neat conclusions. History was never a single door flung open, but a series of hinges creaking over years, decades, lifetimes. She had pulled at one hinge, and others had taken up the work. On a cool morning in late autumn, one of her former protégées, a woman with quick eyes and a sharper tongue, visited her. She was no longer the shy girl who had once listened to Jennie in awe. She was now a leader in the suffrage movement, her name appearing in newspapers, her speeches drawing both applause and anger. She sat by the fire with the confidence of someone who no longer needed to ask permission to exist. "They say we may finally have the vote," she told Jennie, her voice threaded with both hope and exhaustion. "Not soon, but soon enough to taste it." Jennie smiled. Not the quick, luminous smile of her youth, but the slower, knowing curve of a woman who has seen how time bends. "History," Jennie said softly, "is a long conversation. You and I are only a few of its voices." Her protégé looked at her with something close to reverence. Jennie felt no need for it. What mattered was not her own place in that conversation, but that it was still going on. Evenings in these later years often found her in her garden. It was small, hemmed in by brick walls, but the roses had grown wild in their corners, and she loved the way their scent drifted through the cool air. She would sit wrapped in a shawl, listening to the faint sounds of the city beyond the wall, the distant rumble of carriages, the occasional cry of a newspaper boy, the rustling of wind against trees. She thought often now not of the choices she had made, but of the doors she had left closed, and how much of her life had been shaped not by grand gestures, but by a single, quiet refusal made decades before. That refusal had rippled outward, not as she intended, but in ways she could never have imagined. The empire, once so unshakable, now bore hairline fractures visible to anyone willing to look closely. Jennie had not caused them, but she had pressed her fingertips against the stone when few others dared. She saw now how those cracks widened with each new voice raised, not hers anymore, but theirs. And that, she thought, was as it should be. The winter sun set early now, laying a faint gold across the garden wall. She watched it without hurry, without yearning. A woman who has lived her own life and not the one written for her need not chase the light. She need only sit in its fading warmth. The winter sun set slowly, but she was not alone in its light. The spring of 1914 brought with it a strange, heavy stillness that seemed to rest over all of Europe. It was not the silence of peace, but the kind that comes just before something breaks. Newspapers carried tense headlines about alliances and threats. Men in Parliament spoke in the taut language of inevitability, and in the cafes and streets of London there was a feeling, a pressure in the air that everything the world thought was unshakable might soon shift. Jennie felt it too. She had lived long enough to sense when the ground beneath history trembled, and this, she knew, was no passing tremor. The world she had shaped her life in, the empire she had resisted, questioned, and quietly pulled against, was on the brink of tearing itself open. Had her life taken the path that was once laid out for her, she would have been the mother of a man at the center of this gathering storm. Winston Churchill, in that other timeline, would have been seated in power, preparing fleets, drafting plans, speaking with the fiery certainty that would rally millions. But in this one, there was no Winston. There was no Churchill at the Admiralty, no charismatic orator to lend thunder to the imperial war machine. The government moved forward still, its leaders driven by old ambitions, tangled alliances, and the stubborn illusions of supremacy. But something about its march lacked its old, unyielding rhythm. It hesitated where it might have surged. It faltered in places history once remembered as decisive. And in that hesitation, the storm gathered in a different shape. Jennie observed all this not as a participant, but as a witness. She was no longer the young woman challenging polite drawing rooms, nor the restless traveler who had stared down the face of empire in distant lands. She was an older woman now, slower in movement, quieter in presence, but her mind was as keen as ever. She spent long hours reading newspapers by the fire, her shawl drawn around her shoulders, tracing the slow unraveling of a world she had always known to be fragile beneath its polished surface. Friends and former allies came to visit, anxious and uncertain, speaking of war as if it were a storm front they could neither stop nor fully understand. Some still clung to the old myths of glory. Others saw more clearly. Jennie listened to them all with the calm of someone who had spent a lifetime watching the lies of power peel away. When war finally came that summer, it did not arrive with the triumphant blare that many had expected. It arrived with a kind of grim, confused inevitability. The great empire still entered the conflict, but its path through it was different. Quieter, slower. Without Winston Churchill's forceful voice at the Admiralty, naval plans faltered and shifted. The push toward escalation was less certain. Where once there would have been fiery speeches and stirring declarations, there was instead a dull, bureaucratic tone, less persuasive, less unified. Britain still fought, but its spirit was less possessed by the fever of destiny. And in that difference, countless smaller differences took root. Alliances stretched thinner, fronts shifted slower, decisions took longer to harden. It was as if history itself had drawn a slightly different breath. Jennie did not celebrate any of this. War, no matter its shape, remained what it always was, a slow devouring of lives. She saw it in the faces of the young men she passed on the street, boys in uniforms too large for their narrow shoulders. She saw it in the black-edged telegrams delivered to houses near hers. She saw it in the quiet terror that sat behind every brave smile. She had lived through one world already and knew too well that the machinery of power ground on, indifferent to the soft human voices caught beneath its wheels. But she also saw something she had not expected. In the pauses and hesitations of this altered war, other voices began to rise more quickly than before. Anti-war sentiment, women's organizing, colonial resistance, all found cracks through which to grow. There was less room for one single myth to dominate the story. The empire, lacking the figure who might have made war into a righteous narrative, struggled to contain the multiplicity of voices that filled the void. It was as if the chorus of history was no longer being conducted by one hand, but allowed to speak in many tones. Jennie spent those war years mostly at home. She no longer hosted crowded salons, but a few trusted friends would gather by her fire. Poets, journalists, women who had marched, men returned from the front with their eyes hollowed by things they would not say. They came not to strategize, but to breathe, to remember, if only for an hour, that the world was larger than uniforms and guns. Sometimes Jennie spoke, often she simply listened, and it was enough. In the long quiet of those years, she thought often of the young woman she had been in 1874, standing by the sea on the Isle of Wight, her hand resting on a railing, the wind in her face. She remembered the weight of that moment, how small and insignificant her refusal had felt against the vastness of the world, and yet that single quiet no had echoed across decades, touching lives she would never know. It had not stopped the war, but it had changed its shape, softened its edges, loosened its certainties. And in a world that measured greatness in armies and monuments, she took quiet solace in knowing that sometimes the smallest turning of a single life could alter the current of a river. History did not need her son to burn the world. It needed her voice to remind it what fire costs. The world that emerged from the Great War was quieter, but not in the way peace is quiet. It was a silence that lay heavily over cities and fields alike, a silence filled with the breath of millions of lives altered or erased. London moved more slowly in those first post-war years, its streets lined with men who had returned with empty gazes and those who had not returned at all. The empire remained, still draped in its banners, still speaking in its grand voice, but something within it had loosened. It no longer rang with the same certainty. The myths that had carried it for so long were frayed and trembling at the edges, and within that trembling, something new began to take shape. A world where questions that had once been whispered now found their way into the open. Jennie felt it keenly. She was older now, her movements careful, her steps measured, but she had not withdrawn from the world entirely. She had lived long enough to understand that history does not end with the thunder of guns. It reshapes itself in the hush that follows. And in this hush, she began to see the faint outlines of a world that might have been impossible in her youth. Women walked with a surer stride now, less apologetic. Political movements rose not only in Britain, but across its vast, uneasy empire. India's voice grew louder. Ireland's demands deepened. In Africa, in the Caribbean, in places once reduced to names on maps, people spoke of themselves not as subjects, but as nations. The war had shaken the imperial mask, and what emerged from behind it could no longer be ignored. She received visitors again. Not the feverish throngs of her middle years, but a steady trickle of young people who sought her out. Many had only heard her name in fragments, in the footnotes of articles or the whispered recollections of their teachers. They knew her not as a figure of grandeur, but as a woman who had been there before the tide began to turn, who had sown seeds before the field had been ready to bloom. They arrived with the urgency of a new generation, impatient, restless, unwilling to accept the half-answers that had satisfied their parents. Some were young suffragists, buoyed by the hard-won promise of political rights. Others came from colonies, educated in Britain yet carrying the heat of home in their voices, questioning why they should remain tethered to an empire whose own confidence was faltering. They spoke to her not as a leader, but as an elder, a quiet center around which they could think more clearly. She would sit in her chair by the window, wrapped in a shawl, listening to their voices fill the room. Sometimes she offered only a few words, sometimes a story from the years when such conversations were unthinkable in respectable society. It amazed her in small, quiet ways how much had changed. The questions she had once posed carefully, softly, as if slipping them between cracks in the walls, were now being shouted from platforms and printed on banners. They no longer needed her to ask them, but she liked to think in some hidden corner of time that perhaps she had helped to make it possible for them to be asked at all. In 1921, she read in the morning papers of the growing strength of the Irish Free State. She had lived long enough to see a story she had once discussed in whispers come alive as political fact. She thought of the man she had loved all those years ago, the Irish writer who had walked with her through London fog, who had believed that words could carve cracks into empires. He was gone now, as were many of those who had walked beside her in youth, but their words, like hers, had outlived their voices. That is how movements truly endure, not in monuments but in echoes. Women's voices, too, now filled spaces they had once been denied. Her protégés had become formidable in their own right, some serving in public office, others writing, teaching, leading. They no longer needed to meet in the corners of parlors. They stood on the floors of Parliament, in newspapers, in universities. They disagreed with one another fiercely, sometimes even with her memory, and Jennie found that beautiful. Movements that last are never singular. They grow many heads, many tongues. The generation she had once guided now argued with the world she had helped them inherit. It was exactly as it should be. The empire itself had grown more brittle, though it still clung to its grandeur. Without the wartime oratory of Winston Churchill, the myth of British destiny had dimmed. In its place was a kind of uneasy pragmatism, an empire uncertain of its own story. Decisions that might once have been pushed through on the tide of a single voice were now mired in hesitation. This hesitation, Jennie knew, was not weakness. It was the beginning of the world remembering itself differently. One spring afternoon in 1922, she sat with a group of young women on the steps of her small garden. The roses were blooming again, unruly as ever, climbing over the old bricks in defiance of careful pruning. The women spoke with the unguarded confidence of those born into a different season of history. They spoke of labor rights, of independence movements, of the vote not as a dream but as a foundation upon which to build something more. She watched them as the light shifted slowly across their faces, and for the first time in many years, she felt not the weight of history but its lightness. It moved beyond her now, and that was right. She had never wanted it to belong to her alone. She thought then of the young woman she had once been, and the door she had left closed at Cowes all those years ago. She could still feel the cool air of that evening on her skin, the soft sound of the tide against the shore, the quiet certainty of her refusal. Everything that followed, every essay, every conversation, every movement and moment, had grown like a tree from that single root. And now, in her old age, she could see the forest that had grown from it, even if she no longer walked beneath its branches. Legends are seldom written by those who live them. The year 1926 unfolded like a final chapter written in soft ink, its edges already fading into memory even as it was lived. Jennie Jerome's body, long a quiet and steadfast companion to her will, had grown fragile. She moved slowly through her house now, each step deliberate, like a pen tracing the last lines of a long letter. Her once dark hair had turned the color of winter ash, and her hands bore the elegant frailty of age, but her mind remained lit by the same steady flame that had carried her through every turning of history she had witnessed. She did not fear the end. She had made peace with it long ago, as one might make peace with an old friend who walks behind you for years before finally reaching your side. London had changed almost beyond recognition from the city she first entered as a young woman refusing the future set before her. Trams and motor cars now filled the streets where horse-drawn carriages had once rattled. The gas lamps that once cast their amber halos had been replaced by harsher electric light, burning away the shadows that used to soften the night. The city moved faster, spoke louder, thought differently. The empire itself no longer seemed invincible. Its edges had begun to blur under the pressures of a shifting world. And though the great imperial buildings still stood, they felt to Jennie like aging actors on a stage long past its prime, still reciting their lines as the audience prepared to leave. She spent much of that year in her garden. The roses, stubborn and wild, grew just as they always had, indifferent to history, to politics, to human ambition. She liked that about them. Their bloom was neither symbolic nor grand. It was simply life, unbothered by the weight of the world. She would sit in a wicker chair with a blanket across her knees and close her eyes to the sound of the wind in the leaves, breathing in the scent of earth and rain. It was not a grand farewell, but a quiet one. the kind that had marked her entire life. Friends visited, as did a few of the women and men who had once filled her parlor with ideas. They came with flowers, books, soft laughter, sometimes tears they tried to hide. They spoke of the changes that had taken hold of the world, the rising calls for independence across the colonies, the new voices in Parliament, the restless energy of a generation that had never known the world as she had. Jennie listened, as she had always done, with the calm of someone who knew that history is a river, not a monument. It moves on, and it should. Their voices, not hers, belong to the world now. Her passing, when it came that summer, was gentle. The morning light drifted through the curtains of her bedroom, laying a soft gold across the floor. The roses outside were in full bloom, their scent drifting in on a faint breeze. A nurse sat quietly in the corner, her presence more shadow than sound. Jennie's breath grew slower, lighter, as though each exhale carried away a piece of the weight she had carried all her life. She did not struggle. She had no grand last words, no dramatic gesture. She simply closed her eyes, and the quiet that had followed her for decades finally gathered her in its arms. The funeral was modest by design. She had long ago made clear her wishes. No pomp, no speeches, no monuments. A handful of friends, former students, and kindred spirits gathered at the cemetery under a mild gray sky. There were no officials, no royal wreaths, no lines of soldiers. But there were words, not written on marble, but spoken softly by those who had known her. Words of remembrance, words of gratitude, words of lives changed, if only in small, unseen ways. Her name did not belong to the annals of kings or statesmen. It belonged to conversations whispered beneath flickering lamps, to the courage of quiet refusals, to the long, slow unraveling of unquestioned power. In the world that followed, history would look different than it once had. There would be no great speeches from a Prime Minister Churchill to define the 20th century. The war would be remembered not as an age of heroes, but as a long, terrible fracture. The empire would not cling quite so tightly to its myths, nor would its unraveling be heralded by a single figure. Instead, it would be a slow, human, many-voiced unwinding. Jennie's absence in the royal and political chronicles would be complete, but her presence, in the minds she had stirred, the words she had inspired, the silences she had filled with questions, would endure in ways history rarely admits aloud. In a small reading room at Oxford years after her death, a young woman with ink-stained fingers found an old essay published under the name J.L. Rowan. She read it slowly, tracing each sentence as though feeling its weight. It spoke of the quiet power of a single choice. She did not know the woman who had written it. She did not need to. The words were enough. And so Jennie, who had refused to become a symbol of empire, became instead a whisper in its undoing. And so, one door closed as countless others opened. The years that followed Jennie's passing did not pause for remembrance, as history seldom does. They unfolded as they always had, unevenly with both cruelty and grace, shaped by forces too vast for any one person to command. The empire she had lived beneath for her entire life began, in the decades after her death, to fray not with an explosion, but with the quiet, inevitable wear of time. The flags that had once fluttered over distant lands began to come down, not in a single triumphant moment, but one by one, across years. The rhythm of imperial power, once so relentless, slowed into something hesitant, uncertain. It was a story without a single hero, without a single voice dominating its chorus. It was, in many ways, the kind of history Jennie had quietly made space for. There were no monuments to her in this world, no statues in bronze or stone. Her name did not appear in the textbooks of school children, but her influence lingered in places that monuments could not reach. It lived in the language of movements that no longer needed permission to exist. It breathed in the voices of women who stood on platforms, speaking not of what they might one day be allowed to do, but of what they were already doing. It whispered through the shifting winds of colonies that no longer accepted being called possessions. And it glimmered in the quiet, unremarkable courage of countless lives lived more freely than they might have been, had one woman half a century earlier simply nodded her head at a young lord in cows. For a long time, Jennie Jerome existed only as a faint footnote in society pages and gossip columns of her era, a woman who could have been a duchess but chose not to be. But history, like a river, has ways of gathering the unnoticed. Her essays, preserved in the archives of newspapers and journals, slowly resurfaced, reread not for scandal or novelty, but for the clarity of their thought. Scholars pieced together fragments of her life with puzzled fascination. The heiress who wrote under a name that was not her own, the hostess of quiet but consequential gatherings, the woman who traveled where she was not meant to go. She never led a revolution. She never commanded armies. She did not speak in parliaments. Yet in a world shaped by towering figures, her absence had altered the shape of events just as surely as some presences do. Winston Churchill was never born. His voice, the voice that in another world would have stirred nations, was never heard. And because it was never heard, the great machinery of the British Empire turned with less force, its myths less blinding, its wars less certain in their righteousness. This did not make the world kind, but it made it quieter in places where it might have been loudest. It gave other voices room to be heard, not one voice replacing another, but a chorus of many. A world with fewer marble statues and more unrecorded acts of resistance. A history not of singular greatness, but of countless smaller choices, slowly bending the arc of what was once believed unbendable. Somewhere, in a quiet corner of a library in Delhi, a student found one of her articles quoted in an early pamphlet on self-determination. Across the ocean, in a women's reading circle in Boston, her name appeared on a faded leaflet tucked between the pages of a novel. In London itself, where she had walked through fog and revolution of thought, her townhouse in Bloomsbury became a small academic residence, its walls still holding faint echoes of the conversations once spoken beneath its roof. No plaque marked it. It did not need one. Her story became what it had always been meant to be, not a legend carved in stone, but a ripple in the river of history. A life that changed the shape of things not by force, but by refusal. It was the refusal of a door that was meant to close upon her, the refusal of silence, the refusal of invisibility. And from that refusal, generation after generation had found space to build their own voices. That, she would have thought, was enough. The world moved on. The century turned. Empires gave way to nations, and nations to uneasy coalitions. The same patterns of ambition and power played themselves out in new forms, as they always do. But each time a woman spoke in a room where women had once been expected to keep silent, each time a colonial subject stood as a citizen and not a possession, each time power hesitated before declaring its certainty, Jennie Jerome was there. Not as a statue, not as a name, but as a ghost in the foundations of possibility. History belongs to no one. It is built in the spaces where someone chooses to stand still while the world pushes, where someone chooses to say no, and in doing so, let something else, something quieter and truer, be born. She had lived such a life not for glory, but simply because she could not bear to live any other way. And so, as the centuries stretched beyond her, she remained where all such lives remain, not at the center of history's stage, but in the breath between its lines. The world had been altered, gently and irrevocably, by the choice of a young woman standing at the edge of the sea, turning away from the destiny others had written for her. It was not the kind of story that filled history books. It was the kind that shaped them without being named. What destinies lie waiting when a single door stays closed?